listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schleheber here with Michelle Whitty. We're excited for the weekend, but we are more excited for the next half hour to be joined by our favorite, Steve Gerbine, founder and CEO of the nonprofits Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action, and host of the podcast Macro in Cheese. Steve Gerbine, have you ever been to a Renaissance fair? And alternatively, favorite historical time period?
Wow.
Well, I'll ask you that question too, Michelle, when we're done after hearing Steve's response. Steve, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on. I've never been to a Ren Fest, but I have played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, so does that count?
But I think that in Michelle's book, that absolutely counts.
Steve, I started playing during the pandemic. I started playing Dungeons and Dragons after age 40. It has been very fun.
Let me tell you, this is not going to be very leftist of me, but let me just say there's a game that's akin to that is so addictive that if you get into it, you'll blame me for life, and that is Warhammer 40,000.
Okay.
Main vein into addiction of complex gaming, and just trust me on this. If you start it, you won't be able to stop.
I mean, I've now listened to podcasts that are live play campaigns. I'm selective about which ones I listen to. I like them to be entertaining and funny, but one of them has Jeff Goldblum. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, right? It's cool.
What?
Cool people play D&D, guys.
Absolutely.
Ignorant questions here.
Okay.
Two questions. Is there a time? What the Renaissance age is? What years again? Is there like the time period?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Renaissance is like, oh, don't ask me history question.
And
It's
then
like 1500 to 1700,
Okay.
the 1516,
That's fine.
or maybe it's 14.
And then
Crap.
Dungeons and
Definitely not
Dragons.
1300s.
I haven't played Dungeons and Dragons. Is there a time period in which the?
No, it's fantasy. You can have it. It can happen anytime. It's outside of time. It's just fantasy. It's like now, but there's a dragon. Some of them are very real world based.
Oh, okay.
Some of them are,
Okay.
yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Can't believe you just made me potentially look like an idiot.
I was asking because I was asking then, Steve. I don't know if you've heard Steve. I'm saying this again. I'm sorry, Michelle.
Wow. Okay.
You're here with me every day.
Okay.
Been watching a lot of World War II in color.
Yeah.
Netflix documentary. Fantastic. Studying more about the 1900s. But it was making me chuckle the other day, Steve, that it said there was an article like Zoomers had started referring to the 1980s and 1990s as the late 1900s.
Wow.
Just to make all of us feel real old.
Also, 14th to 17th century, I'd just like to say I was exactly correct.
Wow, Michelle.
So,
woo.
Yep.
Let's talk about today.
Bring it back
Let's talk
up
about
to
yesterday.
Joe Biden, born just a little bit after the Renaissance, and that's the man we're talking about right now. Steve, we're going to start with economics, but we're not going to keep you 100% there. But we did have the president give a big speech yesterday on the economy and his agenda, and I want to give you some headlines. I have Biden goes after corporations wealthy in speech on economy. At economic inflection point, Biden leads into expansive populist agenda, and Biden outlines a fair shot for the middle class in economic speech. I just want to ask you generally before we kind of drill down into some details. What did you make of his message yesterday?
Well, it's tough because there's things about this 3.5 trillion that they're talking about doing and so forth that are very good.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot that's just sort of yawn fest.
Yeah.
It's not really anything overly fantastic. And a lot of it's predicated on kind of fanning the flames of Cold War stuff with China,
Mm-hmm.
and that in and of itself should be a red light to all of us.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big things that really jumps out on me that I think is pretty destructive is we fetishize taxing the rich and we fetishize taxing corporations.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing. Bet you're rich because they know how to work money. And when it comes to corporations do not pay taxes typically. They pass that cost on to us.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes a forward cost. And that's when you start seeing, inflation kick in. And inflation's not altogether bad. It just depends on who's getting the money, because inflation means somebody else getting more money. So in this case, since we're going to go ahead and try and tax the rich and, wealth tax and all, and don't get me wrong, there's good, valid reasons to tax these folks. But the idea here is that they're using this because they know it's got an emotional pull. In reality, though, what it signifies is they still haven't figured out economics yet. And that's a little disturbing.
Yes. And that's, I think it's an important point, Stephen. We're going to come back to it. I don't want to ignore what is good in this proposal, in this $3.5 trillion package, because, I think there are a lot of good things in it. And I will celebrate the things that pass that will have an immediate material effect on the lives of people in this country that's going to be positive. Like, that's great. You can't, I don't see the points in sort of arguing against reform in the meantime on principle. You know what I mean? As people push toward a whatever you want to call it, a sort of revolution, an economic overhaul, healthcare overhaul, whatever. The problem sometimes is the person delivering the message, which undercuts it. So I've got a couple of clips from the speech that are not necessarily heavy on detail, but that I think express some of these red flags. So I want to hear here's how Biden frames the choice that he says, the sort of inflection point that we are at in this country and the choice that we have to make. So here's the first clip of Biden speaking yesterday.
I believe that America at this moment is facing such a choice. And the choice is this: are we going to continue with an economy where the overwhelming share of the benefits go to big corporations and the very wealthy? Or are we going to take this moment right now to set this country on a new path? One that invests in this nation, creates real sustained economic growth, and that benefits everyone, including working people and middle-class folks. That's something we haven't realized in this country for decades. The data is absolutely clear. Over the past 40 years, the wealthy have gotten wealthier, and too many corporations have lost their sense of responsibility to their workers, their communities, and the country.
I mean, we're going to come back in the second clip, I think, to the idea of Joe Biden, who has been in government for as long as I've been alive, basically, talking about the need to reverse trends of decades, because this is a man who has been in a very powerful position in government for a long time. But I want to first highlight, I am getting concerned about this talk of corporations losing their sense of responsibility to their communities, because I think we have seen a lot in this administration of making requests of big corporations that they be nicer. Right? We have Biden issuing memos accusing meat processing companies, for example, of price gouging and of benefiting from the monopolies that they have been allowed to establish, which is terrific, unless it means he's not going to actually open any kind of antitrust action against them and is just going to keep scolding them, right? He's accused big pharmaceutical companies of doing similar things. And I know that there are big proposals with regard to healthcare in this reconciliation package, and I hope they pass. But, I see more and more this sort of finger wagging at corporations without ever pushing on some of the governmental levers that could actually force them to change their behavior. And that worries me. I wanted to get your response to that, Steve.
You're exactly correct. For many years, Democrats, and they're the vote blue no matter who variety, and the advisors and the talking heads almost can't fathom that nice rhetoric doesn't keep you sated, doesn't keep you happy and content, that you're actually seeking them to put teeth to what they say and make it happen. Mm-hmm. And so there's didn't you hear Biden's speech? Of course it's the Republicans blocking him, right?
Yeah.
And so they set the stage for it. He has such a nice guy and he thinks these things. And to the average person, not to us who eat, drink, sleep this stuff.
Yeah. The
average person, that's sweet nothings in their ear, and that's enough. They're very happy that Joe Biden's such a nice guy. He's really looking out for us. He wants us all to have a piece of the pie.
Yeah.
And rhetorically speaking, it sounds great. But to your point, though, I'm not big on scolding people that come around finally. If Joe Biden is having I'm going to die soon moment, I want to make sure my legacy looks better than my past, I'm all for it. I'm all about Joe Biden reforming his image by actually doing something useful. But that's not what I see. What I see is, to your point, a lot of performative finger wagging and not a lot of legislative teeth to back it up.
Yeah.
And each step along the way, they've had opportunities to take bold initiatives by he could eliminate student debt immediately with an executive order. He could also immediately, using the emergency provisions in the COVID Act, he could immediately provide Medicare to all, for all, to all right now without an act of Congress. He could literally do it because Congress has already written that in. So there's so many things that Joe Biden says, these sweet nothings, and his sycophants will defend that till the cows come home. But unfortunately, there is no real meaningful pull through. Now, the $3.5 trillion, it's very important because it is addressing some of the future state, Green New Deal style infrastructure. And it takes a broader definition of what infrastructure is, whereas the initial $1 trillion was largely your Eisenhower highways and real core infrastructure type bill. This is starting to go into next generation style infrastructure, from education, job retraining, investments in people, the people infrastructure, not just the structural infrastructure. So there is some good stuff here. It's not perfect. It's nowhere near enough. And I don't want to be on the record as being like somebody who's a gadfly for this. That's not me. But I am suggesting that it is worth noting that there is some value here. But Biden's rhetoric is not matching his actions.
No, not at all. I just want to give a shout out to your great podcast, Macro and Cheese, and I hope people listen to the episode if they want to talk more about or learn more about the infrastructure bills. The interview you did with Robert Hockett was fantastic, and you guys did such a great job of understanding what it means by when you say infrastructure, and what it means when these different politicians put up these competing bills. Yeah, I mean, I just obviously been thinking a lot, Michelle, over the last month here. I keep on seeing this $2 trillion number in regards to Afghanistan. $2 trillion cost $2 trillion. Money's not real, doesn't grow on trees. There is no such thing as like $2 trillion in any like physical, actual sense, but our labor gets turned into tax dollars, and that is what's being spent. It's our resources, it's our time, it's our energy, it's our ingenuity. And so often, though, our media just presents this $2 trillion number, then it's supposed to mean something. But if you look at humans' inability to understand large numbers, you would understand that we struggle to differentiate between what it means to have $1 million, $1 billion, and $1 trillion. And so often somebody will see like that thing cost $20 million, and then that thing costs $1 trillion. Like, well, 20 is more than one, but it's obviously like to the scales of a million versus $1 trillion, something that we can't compare at all. And this $2 trillion number, I mean, just an interesting back of the envelope kind of sketch, Steve. And this, again, is not the best way to think about it. So I'm curious how you would help people frame it and understand it. But if you looked at Washington, D.C., we have a $16 billion budget here. That $2 trillion just straight away would pay for the city to operate for 250 years with that same amount of money. And if you just picked a random city out of the hat, such as Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, they have an annual budget of $120 million. That Afghan price tag would cover the city budget for 16,000 years. So how do you think about $2 trillion, Steve, this huge number, when we talk about issues like you just mentioned, healthcare for everyone, student debt? Because again, it's not just a straight up, is it a straightaway trade? I mean, how do you discuss this guns versus butters economic argument?
Well, it is a resource issue, but I want to say something. This is super, super important, even before we get to this specific thing. Please. Right here. That is that government spending is how money makes it into the economy. Banks don't make money into the economy. Banks put loans into the economy that have to be paid back. Okay. So the operating cash that doesn't ever have to be paid back is the money that the government spends into the economy. Well, when you have been conditioned to believe that anytime the government spends money, it's going to create inflation, or it's socialism, or worse, communism, et cetera, that you have to find a way to keep the economy afloat and spend on things that Jane and Joe six-pack of the right wing and Jane and Joe six-pack of the blue wing find a way to find it acceptable. Now, forget the red wing, which is us lefties on the outside of that, but the rest of them still wear their red, white, and blue. These colors don't run. Ma, pa, apple pie, baseball in the spring, and fight. Defending the troops and so forth is a really, really palatable way of spending money into the economy. And so this is how both Democrat and Republican keep the economy afloat, is by spending where they'll get the least amount of pushback. And obviously, Biden didn't even have to beg. He just added additional money on top of the Trump military budget. You see?
Right.
So this is how we keep from bottoming out, keep from recessions happening on our clock. The minute you talk about cutting military spending and reducing bases and eliminating various military programs, all the different states across the country that have a nut or a bolt or a seat cover or a hat or a towel or anything else, a bullet that they make in their backyard, that money suddenly starts drying up, and that's how they keep their local state municipality going. So we have used military Keynesian approaches to economic planning since Eisenhower. And unfortunately, we have not been able to reclaim the state, so to speak, and shift that spending to domestic spending, because the idea of domestic spending means somebody's getting something free. That means free stuff. That means communism, socialism, you're weak, welfare, and all the rest that entails. So we have a barrier to common sense budgeting. We have a barrier to common sense economic understandings, where we reflexively push back against anything that sounds remotely like socialism in the warped brains of American citizens.
Well, let me ask you.
I think,
Steve, I'm glad you brought up this sort of concept of barriers and who is working together and who's not and what they're working for. Because, one of the things that I kept thinking of when Biden was talking is, who are you talking to? Right? Who are you making this case to? And I've got one more clip that really highlights that he's making a general case for a more, fair application of tax laws. And he starts talking about how much billionaires have made over the pandemic. So let's hear the second clip of Joe Biden.
Everyone was a billionaire before the pandemic began. The total accumulated wealth beyond the billions they already had has gone up by $1.8 trillion. Simply not fair. And how is it possible that 55 of the largest corporations in this country paid $0 in federal income taxes? They made over $40 billion in the year 2020, and they paid zero. Think about that. $0 in federal taxes on $40 billion in profits. How is it possible that the wealthiest billionaires in the country can entirely escape paying income tax on what they've made? How is it possible for millionaires and billionaires that can pay a lower rate of tax than teachers, firefighters, or law enforcement officers? Here's the simple truth. For a long time, this economy has worked great for those at the very top, while ordinary, hardworking Americans, the people who built this country, have been basically cut out of the deal.
So again, Joe Biden asking, how is it possible that this is how our tax law works? I don't have the words for it, because of course you know how it's possible, Joe Biden. You've been there. You've seen how it's made the whole time.
Air Force One just landed in Dover, Delaware. Well, just out of all places for him to be right at this moment.
Right.
Yeah.
But so fine, whatever. That alone, though, I will say, this is not just a rhetorical quibble. It makes me skeptical about the methods he's going to try to employ to reach this goal of a more sort of equitable society. But Steve, when you're talking about barriers, like Joe Biden here he's trying to convince somebody of something, but I genuinely do not know who, because really, the fate of this $3.5 trillion economic package rests in the hands of other Democrats who he is struggling to get in line. If you're saying, he's talking to the American people, I don't think there's a huge appetite among the American public to not raise taxes on the wealthy. Maybe I'm wrong about that, Steve, but who is Biden speaking to here, and what is he actually asking for?
So what Biden is doing is twofold. He's got many audiences that he's speaking to in one, concatenated stream that bursts out in all these different directions. What he's saying here is that to the poor, hey guys, I hear you. I'm really with you.
Right.
Okay. So he's setting up his defense that I've been fighting for the middle class and the poor forever. Right. That's the setup. The other side of this is to say, hey, Joe Manchin, we're going to have to do something where it's going to, people are going to start coming out in the streets with torches and pitchforks if we don't do something. But I think a lot of this is air cover, right? I think a lot of this is sort of, this is just what you're supposed to say, right? Otherwise, somebody kind of raising their eyebrow, like, what are you talking about, right?
Yeah.
This is sort of what you're supposed to say. But what is not stated here, which is deeply disturbing, okay? Whenever you have to claw back gains, people are going to fight tooth and nail.
Yes.
To keep what they've got.
Yep.
What is better is to prevent this from happening by number one, ensuring that laws are encumbered with rules that we have a minimum of 40% of this spending must go to your employees. Mm-hmm. If you can't demonstrate, like anytime I pick a vendor in an RFP doing the work that I do, I have to literally get 3 bids. And we might have an 8A stipulation where you must have a minority sub attached to your bid, or you have a minority sub reaching out to a large company to help provide the stability for the bid. Mm. There's nothing preventing them from saying X amount of this money must go to your employees. If not, we will tax you 100% of it back, or something like. They could do anything like that.
Yeah.
And so the reason that they don't do that is because they know how hard it is to claw back. They know that it's impossible really to get a consensus on raising taxes amongst the wealthy and the donor class and the lobbyists. So the people that are in Congress who don't listen to regular people, because if they did, we'd have had Medicare for all yesterday. Okay. Their modus operandi is, what do my donors think? And their big donors think, don't you dare raise taxes on us. And so this is performative. I don't like that word particularly, but it is performative. It is a hand wave to, this is what we're just supposed to say. And more importantly, I think the real troubling thing is that if Biden were to really, really speak honestly and decouple taxation from spending, we could have a conversation about proper tax policy that would prevent these sorts of things from happening to begin with, while not hijacking the life-saving important spending bills that don't require taxes to fund. And we could have 2 separate, very important conversations. Mm-hmm. What society do we want to have? And he's not doing that. And I do know advisors are, in fact, telling him to do that. But the idea here is that they're going to use the term offsets as opposed to funding. It's just a play on words, but the reality is that they are really, really trying to set the stage that they've been fighting for this all along, all the while knowing that the powers that be will not allow any significant tax increase to happen. And if they do, it'll be for the wrong reasons anyway, because they're not really laying this thing out in a coherent fashion.
They're really not. And I have to say, Bernie Sanders, who, is someone who I really hoped I would have an opportunity to vote for president, has been working on this and is saying, he's saying, I think the president recognizes we've ignored the structural crises facing working class families for a very, very long time. He is someone whose intentions I take pretty seriously. And so, again, I'm not trying to, I don't want to never be pleased. You know what I mean? And I want good things to happen. Mm-hmm. It just is true that, the presentations like this undermine the message and make me question how seriously this is going to be taken and how serious the the methods used to enforce this or to jam it through are going to be, Bob. That's all.
No. And I want to just pivot to a more personal conversation to end here, Steve, with the time we have left, and we can take an extra few minutes if you have it. But the stuff's stressful. I mean, that's at the end of the day, it's like, to your point, Michelle, it's like you're pulling your hair out and you're saying, I don't want to be pulling my hair out right now. Like, this is not the goal. It's like, I really hope he comes out and lies to us so we can all pull our hair out today and be frustrated at the system. And so I wanted to end on this personal note, and I wanted to thank you, Steve, for being open with your sobriety, which you had posted on Facebook this last week, that you were 15 years sober. Congratulations, first and foremost. And I appreciate you sharing that. I too am about 4.5 years without alcohol. And I'm just curious why that was important for you to share. And, you know, something that a lot of us have to deal with, that we struggle with. And this conversation around addiction is really suppressed in so many ways in our country, which then naturally suppresses this other conversation, then how those addictions impact the movements we are a part of. Doing mutual aid work the last year, being in America the last year with COVID, my goodness, how stressed, how much anxiety I know I have. And it's hard. And then you're talking about, well, I want to work harder for the movement, but then I'm feeling the same time this kind of pull on my shoulders and my back and the stress from doing the work that I want to be a part of. And yet we don't have this open conversation around how addiction impacts us, and then how we should deal with it within a very stressful, not only the work is stressful, but then just the personal living in this conditions are also stressful, Steve.
Yeah. So thank you, by the way, for this. So 15 years ago, as of the 15th, I was very, very drunk, blacked out. And my father wouldn't let me drive, took my keys from me. And my dad had supranuclear palsy, which eventually killed him 10 years to the day later after he took my keys. That was my sobriety date, September 15th, 2006. My father passed away September 15th, 2016, right after Bernie Sanders conceded. And just the other day was my 15th sobriety date. And my son was born 2 days after he was born, September 17th.
Wow.
And a lot tied to this, right? And I got a new lease on life thanks to my father for taking my keys. And then he made sure that I would never drink again by dying on my sobriety date. So there's no way out forsake my father and his memory 10 years to the day. But as an activist, as a person that runs two nonprofits, as a person who has a very active day job and children, special needs children, this can really wear you down, and you want to change things. And one of the most important things to remember as an individual is you have no power over people, places, and things. You have power over yourself. And to live life on life's terms doesn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior. It just means accepting that that's what's happening right now, and you don't have to drink over it. And I think for me personally, one of the most empowering memories and messages that I bring through every single day is the fact that we're all enough. We are okay. Everybody's story is not going to be known by everyone. Everyone will not be there. There's little teeny decisions you make in the dark where nobody's looking, where you make a decision to do something kind for someone else, or you make a decision to learn some unique thing, or you make a decision to be useful in some very, very spiritual way that you feel led to do something. I'm not talking religion. I'm talking about within yourself. And I think as activists, we're all, in a sense, spiritual beings because we're really striving to change the world. And because you're trying to change people, places, and things of which you have no real power to change, your goal is to persuade and to educate. And that can be really challenging when you get nothing but pushback. Mm-hmm. And so I think as a recovery person, as somebody that's tempted to flirt with opioids and other things, it's very easy to self-medicate, to try to find an easier, softer way through it. But the fact is we are all soldiers in a sense, and keeping a clear mind and being able to be gentle with yourself and have self-care and really, really put first things first, right? Because it doesn't much matter, if you're a great activist, if you're destroying that which you've been in charge of, which is your family life, your health, you name it. Mm-hmm. So I think that having some good life balance here keeps you from the stinking thinking that sometimes will lead a person that has that proclivity to behaving in an active addiction. And I've, by the grace of God, been able to stay away from a drink for 15 years.
Yeah, there is a little bit. I think making peace with this ephemeral nature of life and every action you take in it, every breath you take in it, that's personally very hard for me. As someone who's wandered around the world and hasn't lived at the same address for more than, I don't know, like 3 years at a time.
Yeah.
I also really hate change, and I really have a hard time accepting that. And that's the process, though, is accepting that. Not everyone is gonna, not everyone's gonna witness every decision that you make. Not the circumstances that you are in now are never going to be permanent. The person you are now is not the person who you might be in 10 years, and that's fine, and that's cool, and you should embrace it. Like you have one life, but you get to sort of embody a lot of different things in it. That's sort of how I view this thing that's painful for me. But also, Steve, what you're talking about a little bit too is the whole like put your oxygen mask on first, which sounds selfish, but is a thing. I think in particular, a lot of mothers have a really hard time with the idea that you do have to spend a little time taking care of yourself. It is in your family's interests that you also be okay and that you be healthy. And it's just, I think there's a lot wrapped up in this idea that, I'm going to boil it down to leisure, and this isn't all leisure, but that somehow that is a luxury rather than a necessity. And I think that as a sort of at a cultural level, we really need to understand that there's nothing wrong with doing nothing, that people should have some more opportunities to not do anything productive, and that we should take it seriously, and that like a life of some kind of dignity and a life that's, I don't want to say what kind of lives are worth living, but really like people working every day shouldn't be the default. And if you work hard enough as a reward, you get a few hours off. That's not how we should be approaching the human condition.
Yeah, I'm going to say one thing. It may sound a little controversial, but you have to kind of know where you are in the times, right? I mean, even look at people who by no fault of their own find themselves in war. Somebody has put them, or they've signed up to be a radio man, and they suddenly end up with a gun in their hand in a foreign land. Even those people find a way to play soccer in between things. But we are in a war, right? And this is where it gets challenging. When I say a war, I don't mean this necessary bullets flying, but there are people dying from austerity. There are people that are losing their homes. There's extreme crime committed against the least able to defend against it. And for somebody with a conscience, it's like if I take my foot off the gas pedal, somebody else will die. Yeah. And that kind of death struggle is very, very hard to pull back from. And I'm telling you firsthand, I get it. Yeah. And I'm not perfect at this, but I will tell you though that, when you do when you take care of your own mind and you talk to people who elevate your spirit and help you get to higher ground with your thoughts and your aspirations, there is some peace that comes with hope. And hope comes from doing things that allow you to see a potential for a different future. And I think that balancing that out is very core. But I think understanding that, the reason we feel this is because we are literally combatants in an ideological war that we didn't ask for, but we're here to fight. And I hats off to everyone that steps into the battlefield of this and really puts it all on the line, but be good to yourself.
Yeah. That's why I just wanted to echo that too. Like, give yourself that grace. I know I'm so hard on myself and so critical on myself. And then I project that onto other people and are critical of others or hard on other people. And man, it's a struggle out here in so many ways. Steve Gerbine, thank you so much for those inspirational and very thoughtful words. You are the founder and CEO of the nonprofits Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action, and the host of the podcast Macro in Cheese. Anything upcoming on any of those platforms you want to highlight and send our listeners to?
Absolutely. We have the new Untouchables, the Pecora Files, which is another show that I do. We will be having Dennis Kucinich on this Sunday night at 8 p.m. And that's extremely exciting. And I hope everybody tunes in. It's on Real Progress in Action on YouTube. Very, very good series. please come check it out.
Awesome. Steve Gerbine, as always, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you both.
So we had to a quick break. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in DC. We're back after this.